Thank you so much, Prasad, and welcome everyone for this amazing next session. Dr. Somshila has put up a very good program overall, and this session is going to be really good, very exciting one. We have surgicals and all Dr. Prasha Narang and Vinita are here. So I'm sure that we are going to have a very good and exciting discussion. So Prasha, can you please invite our first speaker?
Yeah, just before that, welcome Dr. Vikas and Dr. Mukesh. Just a short introduction about our chairpersons. Dr. Vikas is an inspiration to many of us. He's been a mentor and guide to me. He's currently the medical director of LG Eye Institute at Ambala, and he's a prolific cornea surgeon. I invite him to chair the session today.
Thanks, Purvasha. And I will take the opportunity to invite our next chairperson, Dr. Mukesh Taneja, who has been a great teacher and mentor to me from my MBPI days. He was chief consultant in Khmer Site Foundation in Cambodia. And he has been a research alumni in Bascom Palmer and is a prolific cornea surgeon. Dr. Mukesh Taneja, I invite you for this session.
Thank you, Vineet, and thank you, Purvansha.
And those of you who don't know, Purvasha and Vineet are amazing cornea surgeons in LJ and Shroff respectively. So I'm sure we'll have a great session. Purvasha, over to you.
Yeah. So with this, I would like to invite our first speaker, Nidhi, Dr. Nidhi Gupta. She's the corneal consultant at Shroff Eye Institute in Delhi and Shroff Charity Eye Hospital in Delhi. And she would take us through why should we transition to DMEC, a guide for beginners. She has special interests in ocular surface too. Over to you, Dr. Nidhi.
Thanks, Purvasha, and nice to see Dr. Vikas and Vineet here. I'll just start with saying thanks to Dr. Somshila for such a nice academic feast on endothelial keratoplasty here now. So I'll unveil my talk by taking you through that what is the science behind the evolution of the corneal transplant? Why is it important to go on to DSEC and DMEC? Why are they better than PK? Is learning DMEC difficult? I think that's the question in our minds all the time when we are DMEC trying to transit. And what should you do for a smooth transition? So if you look at the transition from PK to DLEC to DSEC to DMEC, over time we realize it is the pursuit for a better vision, for lesser rejection and better long-term outcomes, why we have lesser stromal transplant, which is being coming into evolution. If you look at what is the causes of the penetrating keratoplasty, what are the etiologies for which we are treating transplants, you'll realize about 50 to 60% of the transplants are actually for reasons where there is an endothelial disorder, either in the form of the PBK, Fuchs, or the failed grafts. So anatomically, if you look at it, DMEC is definitely no stromal tissue. So there is no interface haze or irregularity. Anatomically, it is one of the best appositions that you can get. And if you look at the visual outcome in DMEC versus even DSEC, which it definitely has its own place, there is not only a rapid visual improvement, but also that vision remains for a longer time improving. And also there is a lesser rate of best corrected vision is also better, whether for near or for distance. Even with the best of the hands, the ultra thin DSEC still would rate lesser than DMEC. So DMEC definitely visually improves, has a better visual outcome. Unlike what it is in our thoughts and our minds, a mindset that maybe in DMEC we'll have a loss of endothelial cell loss would be greater. The graph in studies shows that it is quite equal to what we do in DSEC. So to conclude, mainly DMEC has lesser rejection rates, has better long-term survival, has lesser need for steroids, and you are also avoiding glaucoma, which is a very major complication of most of our transplant patients. So overall, DMEC is very, very convincing to be adopted over time, especially for surgeons who are DSEC surgeons. So I'll go on to the second part of my talk, which is about guiding the learners. So I think there are a lot of mind blocks. If you look at the learners or early surgeons who are doing very advanced DSEC surgeons also, they definitely feel that DMEC is a difficult surgery. It's an elite surgery to be left with few surgeons. The graft preparation would cause a lot of tissue wastage. Visibility is a problem. And I mean, finally, even if you want to learn, how do you learn? So if you go to look at the studies which have been done on the training part of endothelial keratoplasty, you would see that it is much easier for a DSEC surgeon to shift to a DMEC surgeon. And if you look at the results of any DSEC versus the DMEC surgical outcomes in the learners, they are actually, the graft is very similar. The outcomes are very similar. So there is no fear that you should have that if you're going to shift to DMEC, you're going to lose a patient's vision or you're not going to do well. That's not true. Apart from that, definitely the slide on the left corner shows that if you attend wet lab courses, you have a mentor behind you, and you have various digital platforms which you're going to use, you can have a better shift to DMEC. You can adopt to a DMEC. Having said that, I think for a learner, it's very important to understand there is a place for DSEC and there is a place for DMEC. So if you're going a DMEC in the right indication, which is a PBK with a well-placed IOL, with minimum peripheral anterior sine K and good visibility, DMEC is the surgery you can adopt to. However, in DSEC, it is reserved. It has a place in presence of DMEC as well. And that is the distinction which you have to make in your early learning curve, that you choose the right cases for DMEC. And DSEC is definitely be kept for complicated cases, which the previous session has very nicely, elaborately talked about. Hence, it's important in your mind that you choose your cases very carefully in your learning curve. The three major challenges which have been felt in the early learning curve are at the time of the graft preparation, the graft orientation inside the eye, and the high rate of graft detachment and requiring rebubble post-op. However, if you would look at what are the instrumentations which is required for DSEC versus DMEC, DMEC requires far simpler instruments, and it is much easier to adopt to it because the instrumentation, and it is basically the technique. If you are taught the right technique, it shouldn't be much difficult as compared to DSEC. Also, DMEC is evolving with time. The eye banks are increasingly adopting to a pre-stripped, a preloaded DMEC, which is already being started in the Western world. So it is one step ahead. It will be like an IOL surgery in the coming future where you can inject a DMEC graft into the eye. The next issue, which we said, a mind block, that probably the visibility and the unfolding is going to be a problem. That's absolutely true. In an Indian scenario, having cases of difficult pseudophakic bullous keratopathy, that is one challenge. And probably we need to adapt to means by which you will be able to see the graft better. That shouldn't stop you from doing DMEC. With understanding of the unfolding techniques now, a better understanding of the DMEC unfolding techniques, it is quite simple to open a graft where the visibility is sufficiently good. And there are means by which you can have an anterior chamber viewing systems which are available. A simple light flight from a retina, a colleague, or other means which we can talk in detail in a DMEC session, are the means by which visibility shouldn't be a problem now with marking, etc. Hence, with the growing understanding of the DMEC, the world is adopting to DMEC. So it's already in a lot of countries are moving in their early training program with DMEC. So DSEC and DMEC are going parallel in learning, and we should be able to adopt to it. With the last point, I would just like to say that for people who want to learn, Endothelial Keratoplasty Learners Group is a group with me and Vineet, Dr. Praveen, and Aditya with Mridula have put together a very long course where most of the good EK surgeons, faculty have spoken step by step about DMEC as well DSEC. And you can always choose to go on the Facebook and learn from that. It's a long 40-hour session. And also on the global summit that we are doing, we are also trying to bring a digital wet lab where you can actually try and learn how you can do it on animal and human models, practice to do it. So there are no less platforms available to learn DMEC, with which I would like to just summarize that it's mandatory probably to transit from PK to endothelial keratoplasty in right cases in DSEC and DMEC for the best outcomes for your patients. The learning curve can be shortened by adopting to learning platforms, a right mentor being around, and attending wet lab sessions. And with standardization of technique, with pre-strip tissue available, simple instrumentation, it shouldn't be difficult to adopt to do. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you, Dr. Vikas.
Thank you. Thanks, Nidhi. That was very nicely summarized.
Thank you, Nidhi. Now, with the stage
and there's no doubt that DMEC is a...
Right. So thank you, Dr. Nidhi. With the stage set for DMEC, let's learn from Dr. Vineet Joshi, the cornea consultant at Center for Innovation and the Cornea Institute LVPI, about the various DMEC techniques that are available. Over to you, Vineet.
Thank you, Purvasha, and thank you, Dr. Somshila, for this amazing opportunity. Good afternoon, Dr. Vikas, Dr. Mukesh, Taneja. And thanks, Nidhi, for setting the stage and a fantastic introduction for transition DSEC to DMEC. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to briefly overview different criteria, especially in DMEC techniques like tissue selection, scroll preparation, loading and delivery of the graft, and obviously the most difficult one that we face, the unfolding of the graft in anterior chamber. Now, when it comes to tissue selection, older donor grafts in an earlier learning curve, somewhere more than 60 years, are better, because when they are when we strip it, they tend to form a broader scroll, which is kind of easier to unfold in the anterior chamber with lesser manipulation. So in complex scenarios, like if you're coming across a patient who is high myope, who has deeper anterior chamber, it's better to have a scroll which is from an older donor. Avoid donors who are pseudophakic, because they will tend to have scars at incision sites where you will tend to strip and get a DM tear while during the stripping procedure. Younger age donors tend to have tighter scrolls and they are difficult to unfold, and it's better to avoid them in the earlier learning curve. Also, diabetes is presence of diabetes in donors is a partial, I would say, contraindication, because the tissues tend to have, it's more sticky, adhesive, so it can behave like young age donors. So in scroll preparation, the ultimate goal is to get an adequately sized scroll without any break, with the minimum touch and endothelial cell loss, getting a correct marking, which will help you in visualizing in anterior chamber for the right orientation, and then choosing one method that you are comfortable with. Now, there are various methods like double punch technique, no touch technique, the scuba technique, which involves the no touch technique under MK or media, and some advanced procedures like the yogurt technique by Dr. Zamalis, and inverted DM technique by Dr. Mark Muren, and recently introduced blister technique by Dr. Mark Gorovar. But what I will do is I'll take you through the one that I prefer, which is double punch, where we have two punches, mainly 9.5 and 8 mm in size, which we use along with a curved tying forceps. So here, basically, it's important to center the graft first, and then take a 9 mm Trifine and just give a gentle tap. Avoid going for a through and through punch here, and then stain for a few seconds, so which will give you a perfect rim where you have actually pushed the Trifine through, and then start stripping off the DM tags. You can remove the peripheral Descemet's 360 degrees. This gives a very nice plane to elevate the peripheral Descemet's with the help of Sinskey hook. And once you have 360 degrees elevated the frill, then you can use a curved tying forceps to actually strip the Descemet's in 3 zones, keeping it attached in the center. Now we release the vacuum and we place the 8 mm Trifine, and with that we use the same gentle tap and again stain it and remove the peripheral region. With this, you have a central strip tissue ready, and you can now use to make a scleral pocket window, which is used for marking the Descemet scroll. Now here you have to be careful, be firm to punch it through and through. Otherwise, you have to cut those tags with a Van As forceps, and make sure that you dry out the Descemet scroll before you punch this. Otherwise, it tends to fall back and it will lead to endothelial cell loss due to manipulation. No-touch technique introduced by the Melis group in Netherlands primarily involves using an instrument like a hockey stick, and it is used to dissect desmids from the iris root near Schwalbe's length, just beyond the trabecular mesh where the adhesions are formed. And I thank Dr. Jagdish Reddy to provide his surgical video for the same. The idea is to dissect 360 degrees from the periphery, and this actually, with the help of hockey stick, this helps in giving a uniform dissection plane, very less chances of desmid tear over here. And once you get that 360 degree frill, most of the next procedure can be the same, where you can use the 8 mm size graft and then proceed with the next dissection. The yogurt technique was introduced by Dr. Zamalis, which involves a trephine, which is a size like that of a yogurt, wherein it has a hinge, and these hinges are useful in direct stripping away, like how you peel off the lid of a yogurt can. These trephines are useful, especially in pre-stripped grafts. And the same technique, similar technique, was a hydrodissection, which was an inverted desmids membrane by Dr. Mark Murin, where he uses hydrodissection and place the desmids membrane scroll inverted, where endothelium is inside. And even this is used in pre-stripped tissues. The marking can be made with the help of a Sinskey hook, but you need to dry out the desmid side thoroughly, otherwise it smudges the side. You can use any asymmetric alphabet T, S, L, so that it helps you in identifying the site. Well, I use the Melis tube, which has a thicker end on one side and a narrower end on the other. And with aspirating the scroll towards the center with the help of thicker end, and then changing the side to inject it into the anterior chamber using the thinner end is the ideal procedure. One important thing is you have to avoid any air bubble injection, air bubble in the tube. Preparation of host is pretty similar to DSEC. I would skip this. Loading part also we've covered. What I wanted to bring in to highlight is there are other tubes like Goyder's tube, which is a straighter tube, like not unlike Melis tube, and it's also manufactured in Germany. But this can be connected to a 5 ml syringe and has a beveled tip, but you have to make sure that the tip crosses the pupil before you inject the thing. This technique, and I think Dr. Vikas Mittal has demonstrated this technique many times by using a IOL portable IOL cartridge tip with a 5 ml syringe and maybe a phaco tubing, which can be used to deliver the desmid scroll as well. Now, the unfolding of the graft has been very nicely demonstrated by Dr. Peter Wellman on his website, and different formations of the scroll. So I will just take you very fast through some shapes. So this is one triangular formation which is desirable at the end of every DMEC unfolding, and this is the prior step before it unfolds fully. What is needed is that you should aim to reach to this stage by using different maneuvers. If it is a twisted graft like this, you need to tap at its apex so that it starts opening up and then gives you a double scroll formulation, and then tap into the center of the double scroll to open it up to get that triangle formulation towards the end. Sometimes the scrolls are very tight, then you can introduce a small air bubble in the center, which can be helped to get open up the double scroll, and it helps in unfolding totally. Double cannula is useful to keep one open edge flat and then open up the other end by gliding movements. So finally, what I would like to tell is that though DMEC, there are many techniques involved over here, you need to master one of them and take one technique which you are comfortable with based on your evidence. Not every described variation is critical to be implemented. Measure your outcomes and refine and improve. Thank you.
So thank you, Dr. Vineet. That was brilliant. And moving on next, we come up to the keratoconus part. So I invite Dr. Bhupesh. Dr. Bhupesh Singh is currently he's the cornea consultant at Bharti Eye Clinic in Delhi. He has trained from LVP, Narayan Nethralaya from US as well as Singapore. So I invite you, Dr. Bhupesh, to be starting your presentation now.
Dr. Bhupesh, if you can hear us, you're on mute. So I would request you to please unmute yourself and start your camera. Dr. Bhupesh, can you hear us?
So meanwhile, yeah, maybe we can go over.
Dr. Bhupesh, meanwhile, I would request you to please go with Dr. Astha Singh, who is the next speaker.
Yes. So Astha is a dynamic surgeon. She is the adjunct faculty at Shroff Charity Eye Hospital in Delhi, and she has special interest in cornea as well as ocular surface, and she will be taking us through biosynthetic replacements and stromal regeneration. Over to you, Astha.
Thank you, Dr. Purvasha, for the kind introduction. So today I'm going to talk about biosynthetic replacement and stromal regeneration. So, so why at all do we need a biosynthetic cornea or a biosynthetic replacement? So if we look at the gap that is there are 23 million unilateral corneally blind and 4.8 million bilateral corneal blindness over the world. And there is, however, only one donor cornea which is available for every 70 patients that is needed. Now, the current available options that we have are keratoplasty, and as we all know that the donor rejection rate can be as high as 49% in high-risk cases. They have a 5-year and 10-year survival rates. And the other option being keratoprosthesis, of which only two types are available, and they also come with complications like in the long term, such as glaucoma, and the patient needs to be on lifelong antibiotics. And if we see this very interesting figure from SightLife, India has a large chunk of these corneally blind people, and 90% of the corneally blind, particularly high-risk cases, live in low to middle economic countries. So when we have to tackle this problem and when we look at the burden, so we have to look for solutions beyond cornea and beyond ophthalmology, and we need to collaborate with other departments and other areas such as tissue engineering, regenerative medicine, biomaterials, and the very promising technology of 3D printing. However, these also come with challenges. Like the first challenge is, of course, to develop an animal model which mimics very closely the human disease scenario, so as to have a greater predictability of the performance of what you're developing. And one such challenge, particularly for cornea, is to develop a formulation which is stable and which can functionally integrate with the donor, with the host. And even after you've developed it, there's a long road from translation from animal model to clinical practice. So what I'm going to talk today is about the bioengineered human cornea and the developmental product, the formulation rather we are working on. So it is basically a combination of smart gels, which is a recombinant collagen, which does not have any animal or human origin. And to add to that, we add various growth factors, which would help eventually to maintain the keratocyte health and stromal regeneration. And when we combine these two is what is when we get the bioengineered cornea. So if we look at the lower panel, our aim is to have a scenario where we would achieve a transparent, healthy, and corneal and ocular surface, and which in the current scenario, like with options such as tissue adhesive, which we can see in the center figure, it is something which is opaque and it invites a lot of vascularization. So our goal is the right-hand side type of a scenario where the cornea is clear, devoid of vessels, and the patient can see well. So this, of course, the formulation, whenever we are developing, it goes through various stages. So we have version 1, version 2, but the only aim is to add various, a cocktail of combination of factors which would have least expression of fibrocytic lineage and which would inhibit the conversion of keratocytes to myofibroblasts, which are responsible for fibrosis and scarring. So it is a collaboration with the team at Dr. Shroff Charity Eye Hospital and with the startup which is Bandaram Technologies based in Bangalore. So currently we are at the preclinical stage and we test these formulations on animal models. So we first develop these animal models in a state-of-art facility and with various equipments and for evaluating and for creating these wound models and for applying the formulation. regeneration. So when the first we took the we are testing it and in rabbit corneas because they're close to the human cornea in terms of the diameter. So we do preoperative imaging, and then the step one being creation of a wound. So we can either create this with femto LASIK like we do, or we can use it with lamellar keratectomy and then adding filter paper soaked alkali, which is NaOH, to the bed of the wound to create a nebular to create a macular to leukomatous scar. So it takes about, the first process takes about 3 weeks to develop a clinically great scar, and the rabbits are imaged on various slit lamps and OCT and densitometry. And at 3 weeks, this is the scenario that we get where we have a dense scar. And the opacity score, if we take a look at the bottom left, is somewhere we get a scar with an opacity score of 84, which we plot on a opacity score wheel. So various wound models have been developed. This is the one developed at LVPI, and this was mainly with the mechanical. How ours is different, that we have developed with alkali burnt corneas, and which is a kind of a deep wound. The next step is, of course, to apply the liquid cornea, which is by a minimally invasive application scheme. So in the form of a clear formulation. So the formulation has various parts which are reconstituted, and then we dissect out the scar manually in the OR, and then apply the formulation to the stromal bed. So this is this step 2, and then we follow them over a period of time to see how the stroma is clearing, and how if and in future about for the stromal regeneration. So this is the post-op picture, and this is immediately after liquid cornea formulation. As we can see in the OCT picture, in the deep well, the clear jelly which is sitting, and we place a BCL over the over the structure, and the opacity score on day 1 has fallen down from 84, which was pre-operative, to 62. Then this is at the 14-day follow-up, where we see that the formulation has not dropped off, it has not broken down, it is sitting well. The eye is quiet, it has not incited any inflammation, and this is particularly because of the various growth factors that have been added to the formulation. And the opacity score over time, like over 2 weeks, have fallen down further to 42. So if to summarize, like if we start from the left panel, this is the normal eye, or the normal human eye and the rabbit eye. Then the step 2 is to create a grade 3 clinical scar by creating a wound model, and then application of liquid cornea to see the scarless healing of the cornea. So if we compare it with the other options that we have currently, it is a cyanoacrylate blue, and like I said, the opacity scoring, if you apply a tissue adhesive, it is 100 and the patient cannot see through it. However, with liquid cornea, we can achieve as good as 23, opacity score 23. So there are many other groups which are working. The main advantage of liquid cornea being that it is scalable. We are not using any human donor corneal tissue for the components, and it also inhibits fibrosis, inflammation, as well as neovascularization because of the different factors. So very short, the other studies, we have had pilot trials with a different set of a combination in the past, and the other groups like by the name of Gelcore and bioengineered porcine collagen. The advantage of liquid cornea would, however, be that it would not be of any animal origin and would be completely recombinant technology. Thank you.
So that was a beautiful roundup of the latest innovations in the regeneration of cornea. With this, I would like to invite Dr. Sunita Chaurasia. She is the consultant cornea and anterior segment department, refractive and pediatric cornea services, and also the medical director of the Ramayana Eye Bank at LVPI Hyderabad. She is the authority in corneal transplantation and specifically in endothelial transplantation. So I request Dr. Sunita to please present her talk on endothelial cell-based therapy or endothelial regeneration. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Purvasha, for the kind introduction. So, yes, first of all, I also want to thank everybody for this nice program, especially to the scientific committee. And the talk, I think, is of, the talks have a very good sequence. And now with the DSEC, DMEC, we have current interest in endothelial cell-based therapy. So my talk will cover where are we so far in terms of endothelial cell-based therapy in the present times. Now, a little bit word about the corneal endothelium. We all know that the corneal endothelium is arrested in the stage G1 phase of the cell cycle. And once mature endothelial monolayer has formed, the proliferation and replication ceases to be in vivo. So you don't have replication of the endothelial cells. So how does endothelium heal? We all know that it is by cell enlargement and migration, which are the major means of repair, as a result of which there is an increase in cell size with age. Now, endothelium does retain its proliferative capacity, and given the proper conducive conditions in vitro, these cells can be made to divide in vitro under suitable environment, which means that there's a potential to culture the patient's own endothelium or from the donor corneal endothelium. Now, when we have the standard management of endothelial diseases with the DSEC and DMEC, and they have great outcomes, and as Vineet and they pointed out, the results are gratifying. So why do we need to culture the endothelium? So first and foremost, I would say, like many countries of the world have an unmet demand for donor corneas, and it has kind of, this demand supply ratio has got imbalanced because of COVID times also. And as Asta pointed out, the ratio of one person versus the needy transplants is 1:70. Now, if we are able to culture the corneal endothelium and utilize it for transplantation, the 1:1 ratio can be brought down to 1:8, meaning that with one cornea, we can treat 8 patients. And as per some recent studies which are ongoing and the results which have come from endothelial cell cultures, it is possible to even treat 300 patients with one donor cornea, because you can culture the endothelial cells and provide that number of endothelial cells for transplantation grade. Secondly, we will be able to simplify the endothelial surgery still further, so it will be more acceptable. And thirdly, it is well known that more selective the transplantation becomes, and especially with endothelial cell-based therapy, the chances of rejection are going to be negligible. So this is something which is known, and which is there's evidence coming up for this therapy, and that is also generates one more interest in endothelial cell-based therapy for endothelial problems. Now, what are the main stages of culturing? Now, culturing the endothelial cells, we require 3 critical processes. First, isolation of the endothelial cells, their preservation, and then their expansion into sheets or direct implantation or direct injection into the anterior chamber. So, isolation of endothelial cells is by the standard technique where we peel off the Descemet's membrane from the donor cornea, and now the Descemet's membrane has to be removed, and this is subjected to an enzymatic treatment. This is usually treated with collagenase and trypsin EDTA to remove the Descemet's membrane and just have pure endothelial cells. The loosened up endothelial cells from the detached Descemet's membrane are then pipetted out, and then the endothelial cells are subjected to culture media which promotes the growth of the endothelial cells. And we can use artificial matrices, which could be bare culture dish, it could be amniotic membrane, collagen scaffolds, or lens capsule to expand the endothelium into a monolayer. Now, how do you know we are able to grow the cells? First is direct visualization. We can stain with trypan blue and see them under the light microscope as shown in these pictures, or stain with the alizarin red. Both can be seen under the microscope, as endothelial cells can be made out under the direct examination. Immunohistochemistry also helps to know like how well the cell membrane is. We can stain for sodium potassium ATPase, and certain biomarkers are there, tag 1A3 and tag 2A12, which can be used to know the endothelial cells are there in place. How do you know the functionality of these cells? There's a way of assessing the barrier function by using transendothelial electric potential to know like what we are culturing has a good endothelial function as well. Now, this is one picture to show the culture of the cells which happened, which we did over here from a 1-week-old donor. So this is at 4 days how it appears, and then at 9 days, and then at 12 days. There are certain culture variables which may affect the endothelial cell culture, such as the age of the donor. Younger donors are much easier to culture, and the cells from the periphery is far easier to culture than from the central area. The death to preservation time of the donor does have a role, because if there's a shorter preservation time, we are able to culture the cells much faster and much more easily. There are certain issues related to endothelial culture, such as establishing a standard and consistent protocol, and this is quite a challenge amongst various groups. there is still a way to find out what is the ideal cell culture method, what is the ideal culture media, and what is the best substrate for the cultured endothelial cells. There are certain other challenges. Sometimes the endothelial cells which are being cultured lose their unique structural morphology after several rounds of passages, and some of the cells may lose this much sooner than the other. What typically can happen is that many of the endothelial cells go into a mesenchymal transformation, meaning that they lose their function and they are just like mesenchyme, like a fibroblastic tissue. Certain times there can be fibroblastic contamination while having the culture, so the cells have no function and they can undergo massive apoptosis. So these are the challenges which come in the way of the culture methods. So what is the present status of endothelial culture? So I've just summarized in this slide. So human corneal endothelial cells have been successfully cultured with various protocols of culture methods to a reasonably good extent. There's a possibility to have a good endothelial monolayer with many of the techniques and with certain monolayers and matrices available. The endothelial cell density of transplantation grades can be achieved, and certain pharmacological measures such as Rho kinase inhibitors can help to spread out the endothelial cells on the scaffolds. So this is where the endothelial culture stands as of today. So how do we take these into our practice? Now, how do we apply this? First is endothelial cultures this method can be used to prevent the endothelial cell loss. How do we do that? First, the patients who have got endothelial problems. Now, in those patients who are in the early stage, we can take tissue or cells from them and we can kind of stimulate their own endothelial cells to reproduce. That could be one method. So, second method is to facilitate the proliferation or at least the expansion division in the donor cornea, so that whatever cells you're transplanting have a much higher endothelial cell density compared to what the donor cornea may be having otherwise. Next is to treat the endothelial cell loss. This could be done by transplanting the cultured endothelial cells by direct injection or by using a biomembrane to the cornea of the patients. And the sources of these could be the peripheral skirts of transplanted corneas or the pediatric corneal tissues which do not get utilized for transplantation. What are the methods of delivery? The cell delivery on scaffold was the first method. There are various scaffolds available, like you have the cells and you have expanded on a sheet, and then these can be transplanted into the patient's eye. Now, the common cell delivery scaffolds used are the amniotic membrane, we have the silk fibroin, there's decellularized corneas, and lens capsule also has been attempted. There are certain synthetic and semi-synthetic ones, such as the peptide hydrogels, and this is a sheet on which the endothelial cells can be expanded, and as you see, there's an injector through which this cornea, the cultured donor cells, can be transplanted into the patient's eye. There are other semi-synthetic methods as this one. This is the RAF scaffold, which is also being developed in certain places. And then the most important one is direct endothelial cell injection therapy, which was the landmark Kinoshita's paper, where he reported the 2 years outcomes of direct endothelial cell therapy, where patients, the anterior chamber was injected with cultured cells, and the patient maintained a supine posture followed by recovery of the corneal edema, and results were obtained after serial time points. The initial ways of transplanting the endothelial cells was in animals, but the human transplantation has been performed, and there are two studies. The Parikumar et al. Studies from 2018 is using the scaffold, and Kinoshita's paper and Kinoshita's study from the Japanese group is the direct endothelial cell injection, and where they have achieved good results in patients with Fuchs endothelial dystrophy up to a period of 2 years, 24 weeks to 2 years, and in these nano composite gel sheet, the study duration was about 18 months. Now, where do we stand as of now? We know as of now what we understand is what causes the switch to turn on the regenerative capacity of endothelial cells in vivo is not really known yet. But endothelial cell culture-based therapy is possible, given the culture is a possibility in the lab. And however, what is required is more follow-up data and consistency of the results. Until then, I would say endothelial keratoplasty is here to stay with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sunita, for this beautiful journey, taking us through the journey of endothelial regeneration. Meanwhile, I would like to ask Dr. Mukesh if he's around. Dr. Mukesh?
Yep, tell me.
Yeah, what is your preferred technique of performing DMEK?
My preferred what?
What is your preferred technique of performing DMEK?
What Vineet showed is what we also are doing routinely, in the sense I take a 9mm punch initially and then make a scroll. And after that, refine it further down by about 8mm. And then we use the tube and unscroll it.
Right. And what is your take on the views on the newer treatments that are available now?
I'm waiting for once what Sunita proposed. Once the cultures are available, I think I would like to get rid of DSEC, DMEC, and just push in the endothelial cells and ROCK inhibitor and probably just get it done with. I'm waiting for that day.
Thank you, Dr. Mukesh. And since we are taking a few questions, I wanted to ask Dr. Vikas Mittal his take.
I'm so sorry to interrupt in between, Dr. Vineet. With all due respect, we will have a question answer round at the end of the session if the time permits. So I would request our chairperson to please invite our next speaker.
Okay.
Okay, so next up is Dr. Anubha, and Dr. Anubha Rathi is cornea consultant at the Cornea Institute, LV Prasad Eye Institute, and she would be now taking us through her talk.
Thank you, Dr. Purvasha. Yeah. Am I audible? Are my slides visible?
Yes, your slides are visible and you are audible as well.
Okay. So good evening, everyone. I would be taking you to the journey of corneal neurotization. Before I start, I want to acknowledge the multidisciplinary team that we have here: cornea team, oculoplastics, plastic surgery, and maxillofacial team. So as we can see here, corneal neurotization is a hot topic, and the PubMed search as on June 21, 2021 shows 111 articles with 55 published in the last 2 years only, and 17 of these in the first half of 21. So what the next 8 minutes will look like is that I would take you to what is corneal neurotization, what is the ideal case scenario, how do we do it, and does it work, and if yes, to what extent, and our experience at LV Prasad Eye Institute. So the most common indication that we know of for corneal neurotization is insensate cornea. So insensate cornea, where there are reduced corneal sensations or completely absent corneal sensations, can lead to a poor healing response, leading to neurotrophic keratopathy. The most common causes are herpetic, systemic, and iatrogenic, and we know that it ranges from a simple SPK to epithelial breakdown to stromal lysis or perforation. Management also is stage-based, and we already know this, so I would just brush through. The newer treatment modalities that have been discussed of late are recombinant human nerve growth factor, regenerating agent, polymer eye drops, and a combination of several molecules. But the problem remains. The problem is that the underlying cause of corneal anesthesia remains unaddressed. So that is where corneal neurotization comes in. It's a novel surgical technique that utilizes a donor nerve graft to re-innervate the diseased cornea. The ideal donor nerve for corneal neurotization would be one that is rich in axons, lies close to the pathological cornea, has easy accessibility, minimum surgical morbidity during dissection. And in several studies, the proximal supraorbital nerve has been shown to be the most favorable donor. Coming to the two approaches that are defined for corneal neurotization, there is a direct approach and an indirect approach. The direct approach, it is basically the direct transfer of the donor nerves to the diseased cornea. So it uses supraorbital or supratrochlear nerve. It could be the ipsilateral or the contralateral nerve. In 2009, when direct surgical corneal neurotization was first described, it was an open technique, and open surgery was done, whereas now minimally invasive corneal neurotization or endoscopic corneal neurotization is also performed. Indirect corneal neurotization uses an interpositional nerve graft, which is acting as a conduit to the diseased cornea. So ultimately, we are using the supraorbital or supratrochlear nerve, but interpositionally, we are using an additional nerve graft, which is either taken from the sural nerve or the greater auricular nerve. So studies, there are hardly any studies which are comparing direct with indirect technique. The reason being that the inclusion criteria for the two techniques is very different. And so there are no randomized control trials possible. And the choice mainly depends on the surgeon choice, the patient preference, and the site of pathology. So you need to do a preoperative testing to choose the approach that you should go for. You should test for the supraorbital nerve, the supratrochlear, the infraorbital, and the greater auricular nerve. You need to test for the sensory distribution, whether or not they are healthy, and accordingly choose the donor nerve. So as I said, the first description was in 2009. Something good and something bad came out of this. So the good things were that there were improved corneal sensations, there was improved visual acuity, improved corneal health, but there was denervation of contralateral forehead, scalp, and the larger incision with scarring. Few other studies have studied corneal confocal microscopy post-surgical corneal neurotization, showing sprouting of subbasal nerve fibers as early as 6 months postoperatively. The good aspect of MICN, the minimally invasive corneal neurotization, is that 24 to 33 months after MICN, people have performed corneal transplants with very good reepithelialization within 4 to 8 weeks, and restoration of corneal sensations as to the same level as early as 6 months. This is a histochemistry that was performed, a histopathology that was performed after MICN, which shows the characteristic dot and linear axon profile showing that there is corneal reinnervation. The problem that still remains is that reinnervation that occurs, we do not really know why it is occurring, whether it is direct nerve sprouting or whether it is the neurotrophic factors which are working. So the fact that it takes almost 6 to 12 months for the regeneration to occur, it seems to be more of the factors which take time because they're released as secondary to the Wallerian degeneration and not really the nerve that we are directly putting there. Our experience is of 7 cases that we have now followed up till 13 months postoperatively. And the technique that we followed was an indirect surgical corneal neurotization, where we have used the sural nerve graft from the left leg and taken the contralateral supraorbital nerve, and we have coapted. We coapted the two, and ultimately we have we performed indirect surgical corneal neurotization. The outcome has been fairly encouraging, with improved BCVA in all the cases, the recovery of corneal sensations also in all the cases, and we have improved corneal surface also. Corneal imaging, confocal imaging has also shown encouraging results. This is one case from our case series, and this is a 38-year-old lady who presented with recurrent episodes of pain, redness in the right eye for past 13 years. She had a history of varicella in childhood, with neurotrophic keratopathy was noted with significant thinning, for which a TA-BCL was done. And the BCVA in this eye was counting finger close to face at that time. 11 months after the TA-BCL, she underwent the surgical corneal neurotization, and this is how it looks like at 13 months post-operative visit, with a stabilized ocular surface with reduced density of corneal scarring and vision improvement to counting finger 1 meter. The patient can now appreciate installation of eye drops in the right eye, showing that the sensations have improved. The take clinic message from this presentation would be that we all know neurotrophic keratopathy is a sight-threatening pathology with absent or reduced corneal sensations. Management is a step-ladder pattern, depends on the stage, and surgical corneal neurotization holds a special place because it could be a potential cure. And favorable and comparable outcomes are seen with both the approaches. There is a slight soft corner for the indirect approach, being reduced surgical morbidity, especially if the patient is fit for that and the surgeon is confident in it. Post-neurotization recovery usually takes 3 to 6 months to recover corneal sensations, while nerve regeneration on confocal may take long. So what the future holds, I hope it holds some answers, and we plan to get them. Long-term durability of return of corneal sensation and repair mechanisms, if once the patient has got, whether it stays on or not. Optimal timing, risk of reactivation of the virus or antiviral regimen of corneal neurotization in the herpetic cases, potential healthy bed for future cornea transplants, and the effect of human recombinant nerve growth factor post-neurotization. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Anubha. That was a stellar talk and a great window into the future. And next, I would like to introduce Dr. Swapna Shanbhag, who is my colleague and a faculty in LBPI. She is a passionate clinician and has done
between Dr. Vineet. Dr. Bhupesh is left, so can we go with Dr. Bhupesh once from this session?
Yes, sir, I'm here.
Okay.
If you permit, Dr. Vineet, we can go with him.
Yes, so I would like to introduce Dr. Bhupesh Singh. He's a faculty at Bharti Eye Institute, and he has done fellowship in cornea and cataract services and has been a research fellow in UCLA and SNEC. He's going to talk to us regarding stromal additional techniques in advanced keratoconus. And over to you, Dr. Bhupesh Singh.
Is my screen visible?
Yes, Dr. Bhupesh. Please go ahead.
So first of all, I would like to thank All India Film Society and Dr. Somshila for giving me this opportunity to speak in such a wonderful session. And I'll be speaking on stromal tissue expansion for advanced keratoconus. I have
Dr. Bhupesh, if you're okay, you can start your camera as well. We are not able to see you.
Oh, sorry. Just a second. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Bhupesh.
So I have no financial disclosures in this talk. So we all know that keratoconus is a bilateral, progressive, non-inflammatory eye condition in which there is a thinning and steepening of the cornea occurs. And the traditional option management in keratoconus is RGP trial, lenses, collagen cross-linking, intrastromal ring segment, deep anti-lamellar keratoplasty, and penetrating keratoplasty. So if we talk about the culprit that is there in the keratoconus, there is a decrease in corneal thickness, which results in decrease in corneal biomechanics, which further leads to corneal steepening, and ultimately patient land up in eye drops. So the research idea of this technique is to increase the corneal thickness along with corneal stiffness. So I call this technique as addition keratoplasty because we are adding a tissue to the existing cornea. In this procedure, a corneal pocket is created into anti-stroma with the help of femtosecond laser. The donor lenticule harvested from patients who underwent refractive surgery, that is SMILE, were placed in the lamellar corneal pocket and collagen cross-linking was done. This in turn increases the corneal thickness of advanced keratoconus patients in which epi of cross-linking was not possible initially. So this is the surgical video of one of my patients. So the patient was docked first, and so with this machine, we have to remove a little bit of stroma before inserting a new lenticule. So minimal stromal removal is around 8 to 10 micron. So very thin lenticule was cut first in the patient's eye. And then after opening the anterior and posterior pocket, that thin lenticule was removed from the patient. The lenticule is thin, so we have to be very careful because chances are there that we can leave some tissue behind. So we have to gently open both the anterior and posterior pocket. And then with the help of blunt spatula, we can do the lamellar dissection of the lenticule and we can remove it. Then this is a donor lenticule from the other patient. And we know how much we have removed from the patient. So we know the thickness, what we are going to insert in this patient. So simply we have to push this lenticule inside the stromal pocket. So when we perform this procedure, what we do, we make the stromal pocket 0.1 millimeter larger than the donor lenticule so that the insertion of the lenticule is easy. And we have to make sure that it should reach up to the distal end, not at the proximal end. So after ensuring the complete stability of the lenticule and at the correct position, Then the epithelium is scraped off with the help of the spatula and the hockey stick knife. Cornea is very thin, so we have to be very gentle at this step. And after scraping off, we have to do the standard epi-off cross-linking. We can see the nicely placed lenticule inside the stomal pocket. And on slit lamp, we can confirm its position. So the procedure itself is very simple, but it works very well. So this is a post-op ASOCT at 3 months. We can see the lenticule is nicely placed and there is no scarring in the interface. So I did a small study on this technique. Till now, I have operated around 12 eyes of 12 patients of advanced keratoconus. So the primary criteria for this procedure was those patients in which epi-off cross-linking was not possible. So all the patients in which the thinnest pachymetry was between 350 to 400 microns were included in this study. And the lenticules, those were placed in these eyes were between 90 micron to 120 micron. And the aim was always to make it more than 450 and in between 500. So, and the patients were followed up to 1 year. So if we talk about the result of this technique in these patients, so we have seen there is a significant improvement in corneal pachymetry depending on the lenticule we have added in which patients, and average pachymetry was around 360 in preoperative period, and the postoperative period was around 490 to 500 micron. And the keratometry was reduced. The initial keratometry average was 58 diopters, which reduced to around 56.5. So average 2.5 to 3 diopters flattening were noted after this procedure. The best corrected visual acuity was also improved in all of these cases. And the good part was that there was no complication reported in any of these cases. And till now, no eyes had any graft rejection or any scarring or any infection at 1 year follow-up. So this technique holds significant potential for treating advanced cases of keratoconus. Eyes which are not suitable for collagen cross-linking because of thin cornea can be taken up for cross-linking. And with this technique, the rate of doing deep antilamellar keratoplasty or penetrating keratoplasty in keratoconus eyes can be reduced with this procedure. So in conclusion, the surgical technique is easy to learn and perform. The limitation with this technique is the availability of lenticular extraction system is necessary. The adhesion keratoplasty is an innovative procedure with good outcomes, although the long-term results will further establish this technique as a treatment modality for keratoconus. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Bhupesh. Very innovative technique and nicely done and managed case overall. Towards the end, we will definitely ask some questions to our chairpersons regarding this technique. But for now, I would like to invite Dr. Swapna Shanbhag. She's a dynamic faculty here at LVPI and has been doing cutting edge work in ocular surface disorders like Stevens-Johnson syndrome and chemical injuries. Over to you, Dr. Swapna.
Hi, thank you, Vineet, for the introduction. Am I audible?
Yes, Swapna.
Yeah, so I'll go ahead now. Thank you to the organizers and Dr. Somshila for inviting me to give this talk. So I'll be first talking on mucous membrane grafts and then I'll be speaking on SLED. So when you look at the normal lid margin, this is the lid viper, which rubs against the ocular surface. And then comes the mucocutaneous junction and the gray line. But what happens in a condition such as Stevens-Johnson syndrome is that the lid viper is replaced with skin. That is, there is keratinization, that is posterior mucocutaneous junction migration. As you can see, it should have been somewhere here, but it has migrated onto the tarsal conjunctiva. And then keratin also gets deposited along this area where there is posterior mucocutaneous junction migration. And this is again another patient with upgrade lid margin keratinization. Both are cases of Stevens-Johnson syndrome. So what happens secondary to this is that Where these are rubbing against the cornea, as you can see here, there is keratinized lid margins, mostly nasally in this eye, with trichitis and distichiatic lashes. And you can see most of the corneal changes occurring in those areas. This has been very beautifully described in a paper by Dr. Sheffer Seng in 2005, where they have shown that all the corneal changes correspond very well with the cicatricial eyelid pathologies. So when you have a keratinized lid margin, such as this, what we do is we replace the keratinized lid margin with oral mucosa, mostly from the lip, hence known as labial mucosa. And this is how the outcome is, where we replace this tissue with healthy labial tissue. So what is the function of lid margin mucous membrane grafts? So it minimizes the effect of blink-related trauma. So with every blink, this keratinized lid margin can cause a lot of corneal damage and can cause LSCD because of mechanical changes. And this also reduces lid-related keratopathy and maintains best-corrected visual acuity by preventing further deterioration of the ocular surface. So indications are, again, when there is keratinization of the lid margin associated with lid-related keratopathy. So what is lid-related keratopathy? Wherever the lid margin is keratinized, there is, whenever we stain the cornea with fluorescein, we see corresponding corneal changes, mostly in the form of SPKs. As you can see in this cornea, this is the unstained, these are the unstained images, these are the stained images of the same cornea. And you can see that most of the corneal changes are where the lid margin changes are. So this is lid-related keratopathy, and this should be very clearly assessed in every SJS patient. And if a patient has lid margin keratinization associated with lid-related keratopathy, then yes, a mucous membrane graft is definitely required. So what is the ideal case for lid margin MMG? Early lid-related keratopathy with not very severe corneal changes, a wet eye with a Schirmer's of ideally more than 5, and these are the best cases. And we should ideally avoid prophylactic MMGs where there is no lid-related keratopathy, and keep these patients on close follow-up, and then assess if lid margin MMG is required. So ideal source is, again, any donor mucosal site with non-keratinized epithelium. We use the labial mucosa because the access is very easy for us, and buccal mucosa may be difficult to harvest. So the final intraoperative outcome looks something like this, where you can see that the outer lid margin is sutured with Vicryl, whereas on the inner lid margin we use fibrin glue, and there should be some gap here so that the tarsal conjunctiva can grow up till here and then it stops. So the ideal defect that you make should be larger than the graft that we are supposed to put. So I'm not shown a surgical video here, mainly because we have a very detailed review article which got published earlier this year in the Indian Journal of Ophthalmology. And we have a very detailed surgical technique mentioned there. And you can also there is also a YouTube video mentioned in that article which can be accessed to look at the surgical technique of the lid margin MMG. Now, at the outcomes of mucous membrane grafts, they are mainly, if you look at this eye, both the upper lid and the lower lid margins are keratinized and the cornea is vascularized. However, the corneal vascularization has reduced in density after a mucous membrane graft has been done for both the lids. Again, this is a very, this is almost in the acute stage. Cornea is really affected. It's almost very thinned out, lot of vessels. Very florid keratinization. Again, with a lid margin MMG, with a PROS lens, this patient is doing very well. So we have managed to salvage this eye. There is quite a lot of literature from the SN group, and also we have published in the American Journal of Ophthalmology our outcomes of both lid margin MMG and scleral lenses and a combination of both. And this is how the ideal anatomical outcome should be, where this mucocutaneous junction is reconstructed appropriately. And the functional outcome is actually really beautiful in these cases, because patients who could not open their eyes previously are very symptomatic, are much more comfortable after this technique. So it makes a whole world of difference to these patients. So my conclusion for the MMG presentation is that lid margin keratinization may occur in eyes where AMT has been performed in the acute phase 2, and we should recognize lid margin keratinization in lid-related keratopathy. And MMG prevents deterioration of vision in eyes with lid-related keratopathy. And the natural course of disease needs to be explained to these patients in detail. Now coming to SLET. SLET is again a technique which was described by Dr. Sangwan in this paper in BJO in 2012. It's a technique used for unilateral limbal stem cell deficiency. And this paper had 6 eyes, which showed a completely epithelialized avascular stable corneal surface by 6 weeks. It's a magical procedure. And if you look at this, this is preoperative LSCD, and this is how beautiful it looks at 1 year. Again, another eye with LSCD, 1 day, 1 month, and at 1 year, it is almost like no surgical procedure was done in this eye. So ideal candidates are patients with unilateral LSCD with a clinically non-inflamed wet surface. So if we compare SLET with other techniques such as CLET and CLOW for autologous, for unilateral LSCD, the cost factor for SLET is very less because we do not need a lab like CLET. And also the risk of iatrogenic LSCD is less compared to CLOW because we only harvest 1 clock hour. This is a case where I'll show you the surgical video. This is a young child with SLET with Symblepharon, and both SLET and Symblepharon were actually treated in the same surgical setting. Here I'm taking the limbal biopsy from the normal eye, and I'm also harvesting the conjunctiva inferiorly to do a conjunctival autograft. This child had a Symblepharon in 2 quadrants. So if you look at this, I'm releasing the panels, I'm removing the Symblepharon in this eye. And after removing the Symblepharon, I know I need to do a conjunctival autograft in those 2 areas where the Symblepharon was the most dense. So after removing the panels, after removing the panels, I have sutured the conjunctival autograft. As you can see, I'm suturing it inferiorly, and I'll also be suturing it superiorly. And after suturing it, I'll be placing an amniotic membrane graft here. And after placing the amniotic membrane graft, I've kept the explants. And this patient actually did very well post-operatively. So this is the post-operative outcome at 1 year. No recurrence of LSCD, no recurrence of Symblepharon. SLET, the epithelialization of the ocular surface happens within 14 days with each explant releasing epithelium on all sides. And we have also shown this on ASOCT, where we have shown that the epithelium grows out of these transplants. And we have also published this and shown the outcomes at a long follow-up of 6 months, where we can see the retained AMG and the epithelium above it. The outcomes have been also published in 125 eyes, where the outcomes are very good in both adults and children, with almost 70 to 80% success, both functional and anatomical. In the donor eye, the amount of complications are very less. LSCD is 0, and conjunctivalization and Symblepharon are also minimal, can be treated. However, this is in the recipient eye. We do not see much of LSCD in the donor eye because we just harvest 1 clock hour. So looking at 4 studies, the outcomes of SLET in these 4 studies have been very good. So SLET is a very replicable process. It's a very easy process for anybody to learn. And it is magical for our patients for all cases of unilateral LSCD. If a patient has both Symblepharon and LSCD, can be also addressed at the same visit. So thank you for giving me the opportunity. So I'll end my talk here.
Hey, thanks, Swapna. Very nicely covered comprehensively about MMG and SLET. And now to just continue this one step further, I would like to invite Dr. Swapnil Balekar, who is an alumnus of PGI and a past fellow of LVPI in cornea and external disease. He's a founder of Vision Eye Care Center, and I would invite him to his talk on minor salivary gland transplantation. Over to you, Dr. Swapnil.
Good evening. Thank you, Dr. Somshila and organizers for the kind invitation. So my topic is minor salivary gland transplantation for severe dry eyes. So let's see what exactly is minor salivary gland transplantation. So these are the minor salivary glands which are mainly distributed throughout the oral mucosa, and they form the compact layer beneath the mucosa, which are nothing but a single lobule beneath the mucosa. And if we look at the histopathology of the glands, then each gland has the seromucinous component which forms a duct and it opens onto the mucosa. So essentially this is a mucosa and gland complex which we are going to transplant onto the ocular surface, and that's how it is going to be minor salivary gland transplantation on the ocular surface. So if we look at the secretions of the minor salivary glands, they are spontaneous, so they have a higher viscosity than tears, there is a large amount of antimicrobial peptides in these tears, and also lipid level is 4 to 5 times higher than in other salivary gland secretions. Indications for obvious reasons, in Sjogren's syndrome, there are non-functioning salivary glands. So absolutely it is a contraindication for minor salivary gland transplantation. So we mainly do it for dry eye associated with Stevens-Johnson syndrome, where minor salivary glands are functioning. What exactly we do is we take out the mucosa and gland complex. We can see over here in the middle image, and then we create a conjunctival pocket superiorly over the superior rectus muscle, which is exposed over here, and then suture that mucosa gland complex onto the superior rectus muscle so that it will get vascularized properly. And the advantage of this location is the lid will move onto the surface of the gland and take the secretions down onto the cornea, which will be beneficial. Important factor is size of the graft. So now if we take more larger graft, there would be more number of glands and we'll have more secretions on the ocular surface. Mainly inclusion criteria is SJS patients with severe symptoms, and also there should be some Schirmer value between 0 to 2, but the surface should not be completely dry dermatalized surface, because if we have a dry dermatalized surface, then probably the salivary gland transplant won't work. And exclusion criteria is again a primary or secondary Sjogren's syndrome and active infection. There have been attempts of doing minor salivary gland transplantation in the past, and there have been n number of reports where salivary glands have been sutured into the inferior fornix, they have been sutured onto the upper tarsus, and invariably all of these papers have shown very good results in terms of improved corneal clarity, decreased vascularization, and improved symptoms. So these are a few of the results in the past. And where we have done the technique differently is if we look at the older papers and if we look at their pictures, so those glands are directly placed over the scleral surface or tenon surface. So there are very much chances that in long-term failure is because of subconjunctival fibrosis, which makes the gland dysfunctional, and that's why there is a long-term failure. So this is where our technique differs, where what we did is, so we can see this is a mucosal layer, here is the salivary gland, and we have preserved an additional layer of muscle, orbicularis muscle, onto the gland, so that this muscle will be placed onto the scleral surface or scleral superior rectus muscle, and that won't create this, that will avoid the fibrosis in between the glands. So this is how our technique differed, and the modified technique of MSGT was published in BJO last year. So these are some of the differences, that we have a muscle layer covering the glands so that it will prevent the fibrosis. We are also able to take a large amount of tissue because the space in the upper on the suprabulbar surface is more, and also there is robust source of vascularization because we are placing the tissue directly onto the superior rectus villi. So let's see how exactly we do it. So first step, as we saw it, making the conjunctival pocket. So we make an incision around 8 to 9 millimeter posterior to the limbus, depending on how much is the symblepharon. And then we try to make a conjunctival pocket. Here, it is very important not to separate the tenons and the conjunctiva, because if you try to separate it anteriorly, there are chances that once you place the salivary glands into the pocket, the tears might sip beneath the conjunctiva and it might form a blade like trabeculectomy. So here you can see I'm also excising an excessive tenon so that I'll get a more space, and also it will reduce the fibrosis beneath the glands. So I'll place my glands directly over the episclera or maybe a sclera directly. And then you can make a pocket posteriorly. Try to make an incision as large as possible so that you will get a larger pocket and you will be able to take a larger graft, and then bridle the superior rectus muscle. Next is harvesting the graft. So the most common site to harvest and most easy is lower labial tissue. Usually we make a D-shaped incision so that the glands are maximum in the center and minimum in the periphery. So we try to take maximum glands from the center, and our pocket is also of that shape. Initial incision is very superficial. I have already infiltrated with lignocaine and adrenaline, so there would be less bleeding. And then once you take a superficial incision with 15 number blade, and when you start from the periphery, you go superficial. But once you try to dissect the glands, you can see I have turned my scissor down. So I'm going down and dissecting the muscle so that the muscle layer would be preserved over the minor salivary glands, and that would prevent the fibrosis. So you can see in the third video, I'm preparing the graft and I'm trimming the muscle over the glands. So this, because it is too bulky, but we are preserving the muscle layer over the glands nicely. And the last step is suturing the gland. So this is very important step, first step, where I'm passing the mattress suture through the suprarectus villi, and the same suture is passed through the glands, muscle over the glands. And here, the most important is placing the glands firmly onto the suprarectus villi. So now you can see it is sitting firmly over that. And now I'm suturing that mucosa to the sclera at two ends. This is again very important step, because if it is sitting firmly, then it will get vascularized quickly, because this is a bulky tissue. If it sits loosely, then it will not get vascularized and it will necrose. And then you have to make a watertight junction between surrounding conjunctiva and the mucosa. And this is how I have sealed it all around. And once we remove the speculum, you can see magically the gland will disappear into the fornix. And that's where that's the end of the procedure. So if we look at the results, this is one of the initial case, and you can see there is a severe photophobia. This is 4 years follow-up. You can see patient is opening eyes properly. This is again a case where nothing was possible. I decided not to do a type 2 K-Pro, and I did MSGT with allocelate in SJS. Vision was PL positive. Now she is ambulatory and maintaining her vision very well with nice surface. This is again a case of SJS. You can see a dry, completely dry surface, and post MSGT you can see wet surface, and she's again having ambulatory vision. This is another case with severe photophobia, and you can see patient is opening eyes nicely. You can see nicely sitting salivary glands over here. This is another case where there is a lot of corneal keratinization, which has decreased with improvement of corneal clarity in the post-op period. This patient, I have done MSGT in the left eye, and you can see improved clarity in the left eye, where right eye remained dry because I couldn't do any transplant in that because of systemic issues. This is only one case I have done in OCP, where I tried an MSGT. It worked partially, patient became comfortable, but eventually it failed. This is how we measure the minor salivary gland secretion. So you can place like a Seidl's test. You can place a fluorescent strip over it, and you can see the glands are functioning and secrete the tears. Same way we can measure the labial secretions. This we published in BJO last year, where 29 patients were studied, and all of them have symptomatic improvement along with improvement in best corrected visual acuity. These are the results. You can see corneal scarring decreased significantly in the subsequent follow-up. So that's all about minor salivary gland transplantation. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thanks, Dr. Swapnil. Excellent surgical techniques, especially the OCP case. Next, I would like to invite an esteemed faculty from Shankar Nethralaya, Dr. Bhaskar Srinivasan, who is also an alumnus of Armed Forces Medical College. And he has keen interest in ocular surface and especially the keratoprosthesis part of the same. I would invite Dr. Bhaskar Srinivasan to go ahead with his talk. Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Vineet, for the introduction. And I would like to thank Somshila for inviting me for the session. And just share my screen. Is the screen visible?
Yes,
Doctor. So basically, we'll be going through a brief overview of keratoprosthesis as what we have at this point of time. No financial disclosures here. So I would be going through the different types of keratoprosthesis, the indications, the preoperative issues, assessment, and the techniques, and just show some of our results with challenging cases. So when you're talking of keratoprosthesis, the primary indication is a patient who has bilateral corneal blindness. By and large, most keratoprosthesis surgeons do not advocate keratoprosthesis when there is some vision in the other eye. And if you look at literature, most of the cases that have had keratoprosthesis are primarily those which were due to multiple failed grafts. If you look at Stevens-Johnson's OCP and chemical injury, they form a smaller subset, but these are the most challenging cases where we actually need to perform keratoprosthesis. So if you look at type of keratoprosthesis, you have it as either a biocompatible, where you have the Boston type 1, the biointegrated, the Pinto-G. Unfortunately, it's not freely available these days. And you have the biological keratoprosthesis, where you have either the osteoodontal keratoprosthesis or the tibial keratoprosthesis. When you're talking of Boston type 1 keratoprosthesis, the indication basically is in a moist eye where there is good blink, there is no exposure of the ocular surface, and preferably in a non-immunological condition,
When I say a non-immunological condition, I basically mean SJS and OCP, because in these cases, you would probably prefer a type 2 keratoprosthesis. Also, some of the severe chemical injuries where there's significant lid globe anomalies, you would probably want to do a type 2 keratoprosthesis rather than a type 1 keratoprosthesis. Coming to the choice of keratoprosthesis, when it's a keratinized ocular surface or with severe lid globe anomalies, you would probably look at MOOKP being the keratoprosthesis of choice. However, in a patient who's edentulous or with poor oral hygiene, you might look at the tibial keratoprosthesis, or you might look at the Boston type 2 keratoprosthesis, especially if the patient cannot have multiple general anesthesia procedures during because of his age or systemic condition. Pediatric keratoprosthesis at this point of time is not routinely recommended. So when you're looking at preoperative assessment, obviously the potential of vision has to be noted. The ocular status with respect to the lens status, the axial length has to be noted. The IOP has to be measured. If it is not possible with any instrument, a finger tension probably would be the way to go. You have the option of looking at the angle chambers with the help of a UBM, or looking at the posterior segment with the help of the endoscope. And you need to be sure that the patient has systemic fitness for general anesthesia. Psychological counseling plays a very important role, and lifelong follow-up cosmesis, and the patient should have realistic expectation. Coming to the Boston type 1 keratoprosthesis, you also have the orokeratoprosthesis, which is made in India by Orolab. So this video basically shows the assembly of the keratoprosthesis, and it's a fairly simple assembly where you place the optic at the center on a sticky tape so that it doesn't move. Keep the punched cornea on it, and then you put a back plate, and then the entire assembly is secured with a titanium locking ring. At this point of time, you also now have a click-on or a snap-on back plate, and you have the back plate which is being changed from the PMMA to the titanium because it is more better biocompatible. In a type 1, you basically need lifelong prophylactic antibiotics. You would probably need a contact lens to keep the cornea hydrated. You also have the option of newer tissues for the optic in the form of a cross-linked donor cornea, which are being tried. The post-operative care basically is in the form of topical steroid, which is tapered and continued at twice a day or once a day endlessly. And you also have topical antibiotics in the form of 4th generation fluoroquinolones and a vancomycin or a chloramphenicol, which is continued twice a day lifelong because the patients are on contact lenses. We do advocate povidone-iodine washes, that is betadine, once a day, once a week. And we normally give voriconazole drops for a couple of days every 2 months. This was one of our first patients where we did keratoprosthesis, the Boston type 1, for a silicon-induced keratopathy. And she's maintained 20/60 vision for about a 13-year follow-up. And this is what we published in 2011. This is another patient who developed a bilateral chemical injury, had a bilateral PK, and then he underwent a Boston K-Pro and is maintaining 20/100 vision. A patient with a failed graft maintaining 20/80 vision. One of our pediatric patients who has some amount of ambulatory vision, which is a pediatric sclerocornea, who had multiple failed grafts. All keratoprostheses are prone to complications, so you might have to look at epithelial defects, and if it is not managed properly, would lead to melts, which requires anacrylate glue and fistula formation or an LK. And the most dreaded complication would be endophthalmitis that you would want to be aware of. When you have corneal melts, you might want to do a lamellar graft. You can do a partial lamellar graft where you are doing it like a crescentic lamellar graft, or you might want to complete the 360-degree graft where you have to snip the tissue in between and hug the graft around the optic. So our results, we've done about 65 patients where we've had about 80% anatomical success and about 70% functional success. A type 2 is similar to a type 1, except that you need to have a skin closure to it at the end, and there is a protrusion through which the optic projects out. So our results with about 10 patients, we have had about a success of about 90% in anatomical, and functional success about 7%. And these are some of our patients who have maintained useful vision in their only eye over a period of 7 years, 4 years, and 5 years follow-up. When you're looking at OKP, basically it is done in 3 stages. The first stage is the preparation of the eye, where we remove the iris, remove the lens, and do a PK if required. The next stage, we take the canine teeth, split it into half, drill a hole in it, place an optic cylinder there, and then take a buccal mucous membrane graft and drape the ocular surface. And this is then placed in a cheek and allowed to vascularize. And then finally, the third stage, we place it on the eye, and it is covered by the buccal mucous membrane graft. So the maximum literature report has been by the Falcinelli group, where they have reported a success rate of more than 80%. Our report with about 100 patients that we have done, we have an anatomical success of 68% and a functional success of 66%. OKP also has its own complications. You could have peripheral mucosal melts with protrusion of the bone, which needs to be managed either with a pedicle flap, or if it's more of a central melt, you would need through the lid keratoprosthesis. Laminar resorption is an issue, and we've published our report on how laminar resorption could be managed and the lamina could be salvaged at least for a reasonable period of time. It does have problems of endophthalmitis and RD, but they are also mostly seen in patients where there is laminar resorption. If the lamina is functioning well, generally glaucoma or RPM is very, very unlikely in OOKP. You have the type 2 modifications where basically they were started off as a desperate measure when the lamina gets resorbed and to give vision for these patients. And I would like to thank Professor James Shorosh for giving us the option of using the Lucia type 2. It's no longer available, but you could still use the Boston type 2 under the mucosa in these patients. And the last option would be something called as the Temprano or the tibial keratoprosthesis, where if you don't have a good tooth, but you have a good bone, you could probably use the tibial bone as a carrier or for your optic. And this is done similar to the OOKP in the same stages, except that you're using the bone instead of the tooth. And this is our patient who regained about 636 vision in his only eye. So to conclude, recent modifications have expanded our indications. They have given us better results, have improved outcomes of keratoprosthesis. However, patient selection, counseling, and regular follow-up plays a very important role in maintaining the gains that we have had in these desperate cases. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Srinivasan. An excellent and extensive talk on a very complicated topic, and you did make it look very easier. Thank you very much. Moving ahead, I would like to now invite Dr. Purvasha Narang, who is a dynamic surgeon at LJ Eye Institute and has extensive experience in cornea and cataract procedures, both in government and private setup. Over to you, Dr. Purvasha. I think you're on mute.
So, are my slides visible?
Yes, yes.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Vineet, and thank you, Dr. Somashila and the AIOC Scientific Committee. Thank you so much. So today I'll be taking you through this case of a SJS patient, a 26-year-old male who has basically he had a sterile melt with a very poor ocular surface, and basically his options that he had, the various options that we were considering were application of a tissue adhesive to tackle this perforation, wherein the tissue adhesive itself would have caused a lot of irritation, and with such a poor ocular surface this would have not been a very good idea. Or we were considering a corneal patch graft, but that would have its own epithelialization issues with such bad surface. So we then considered conjunctival flap, but that brings with it a lot of vessels, and that would jeopardize the basically the performance of any optical keratoplasty later, or the use of amniotic membrane graft in such cases. Now we went ahead and performed amniotic membrane graft. In fact, we had to do multiple of these so that we could just seal this perforation, but none of them stayed. We even did a multi-layered amniotic membrane graft, but that also refused to stay. And as you can see here, there was retraction of the amniotic membrane. So finally, we basically performed a Tenon patch graft for this patient. As you can see, this is the Tenon graft, which is opaque, and this is day 1, post-operative day 1 picture with a translucent overlay amniotic membrane over it. We did not use sutures here. This was day 17 picture, wherein the volume of the tissue, the tenon, was reduced and it was getting integrated into the stroma and it was becoming more translucent. This is 4 months post-operative, wherein the tissue is seen well integrated. And finally, this was the picture at 9 months, wherein with the use of scleral lenses, this patient was able to regain a stable ocular surface along with a vision of 6/9 and a reasonably well epithelialized surface. So this is the miracle of a Tenon patch graft. So let's see how does it work and what exactly, what benefits does the Tenon's capsule provide. So it's basically a fibrous structure which is present in all, and it runs from the optic nerve to 2 to 3 millimeters posterior to the limbus. It is basically between the conjunctival epithelium and stroma and the episclera and sclera below, and it also receives attachments from the extraocular muscles over here. It is also known as, inferiorly, it is known as a Lockwood ligament, wherein there is, if there is a blowout fracture of the inferior wall of the orbit also, the eyeball will not prolapse if the tenons is intact. So let's see what are the benefits, where all can it be used. It is usually used to seal perforations of the traumatic kind or sterile perforation seen in ocular surface disorders, mainly due to secondary Sjogren's, like for example in rheumatoid arthritis, or for neurotrophic FZO cases, or in peripheral ulcerative keratitis cases. It can also be used to seal leaking blebs or melts, scleral melts or perforations, maybe after pterygium excision or corneal fistulae. So what are the benefits that it actually offers? It basically provides some amount of volume replacement, not as great as a corneal patch graft, but it does provide some volume replacement. It can be used in a central, paracentral, or peripheral location on the cornea, and can be used to fill up any shape of the perforation. As can be very readily understood, this is no corneal tissue needed graft, so it is easily available. It has zero risk of rejections. It is autologous. It is abundantly available and is free of cost. It is repeatable, provided we remember where we have taken the previous graft from. It does not increase the risk of rejection of keratoplasty in future, as it does not incite a lot of neovascularization. As per the technique, we usually prefer to perform it with a careful peribulbar block, and preoperatively a drop of brimonidine gives a relatively bloodless feel, and a good exposure of conjunctiva is necessary. This is a short video wherein a failed tissue adhesive application is being removed, which had shown micro leaks, and there was a shallow anterior chamber. We are just taking out the tissue adhesive here. Then we take up the conjunctival flap. We make an L-shaped conjunctival flap and reflect it so as to expose the tenons below. These are the adhesions or the trabeculae which are being released, and this is then reflected below to expose the tenon. Sometimes we also make a stromal pocket so that the tenon graft can be actually tucked into it 360 degrees within that perforation. Then we can measure the perforation and harvest the exact amount of tenons. We usually oversize the graft a bit, as tenons is an elastic, very elastic and fibrous tissue. So it's better it tends to retract also. So it's better to oversize the graft. And you just have to pinch grasp the tenons, and you will find a plane just above the sclera wherein you can insinuate the blades of your scissors and then cut along the margins and excise your graft. Right. So when you place it over the cornea, you have to tease it a bit so that you can stretch it out, and then put in a drop of fibrin glue, the two components of fibrin glue over the perforation, and then just place the tenons over there and try and tuck it into the pocket. The tucking in is not mandatory. It should just cover the entire perforation properly. With that, once the glue has settled, you need to cut it from just flush to the patch graft that you have placed. Otherwise, it will just peel off with the tissue itself. And then debride a 1 to 2 mm margin around the perforation so that you can place your amniotic membrane over it. So we did this just as to have a double protection. And then the amniotic membrane is placed over it and then glued together. So that's again application of another fibrin glue. And just for extra protection, we even placed an infinity suture or a cross suture, a partial thickness suture in the cornea. So this gives us a better protection, and we can check the AC formation at the end of the surgery by placing in an air bubble, right? So for larger perforations, we can also put in 2 cross sutures here, right? So there are various modifications many people have offered. They sometimes they use cyanoacrylate glue if fibrin glue is not available. This is preferable only for a very few, very small perforations wherein the glue does not reach the anterior chamber. Otherwise, it would cause a lot of a lot of inflammation. Sometimes people do not prefer to put in the stromal pocket and tuck it in. Some people do not use AMG altogether and just suture it. Some people do not use any sutures. Some people only suture and do not use fibrin glue. So this is a patient's picture which was shared from my friend who did not have access to fibrin glue, cyanoacrylate glue or AMG, and she managed it just by suturing the tenons over the perforation and had good results. So typical post-operative course, you have a boggy tenon in the beginning, which then resolves and thins out and then finally integrates into the host. And even if it's 140 microns thin, it can still withstand further pressures or dynamics like a standard phacoemulsification procedure, as has been reported recently. So avoid areas of glaucoma filtration bleb for graft harvesting and avoid extensive dissection near recti muscles. Cases where I would not do it is in active infections, wherein TA or tissue adhesive would be better, and for large perforations. This is one case where we had a post-tenon graft infection and had been managed by removing the sutures and then placing a tissue adhesive over it. So basically, all in all, tenon patch graft is a very, very helpful procedure and can be a savior when you are in when you don't have corneal tissue or in certain cases as described here. Thank you so much.
Hey, thanks, Dr. Purvasha. Very nicely covered tenon patch graft. Such a handy tool in cases of perforations, especially in cases where you don't have amniotic membrane graft, and nicely demonstrated the surgical techniques and their follow-ups. And now to just cover the same topic, the corneal perforations, but with the current problems that we are facing in the COVID-19 pandemic. And me myself, having done one here with a PPE kit, I know how difficult it is. I would like to invite Dr. Nikunj, who is an alumnus of RIU Sitapur, and he's a prolific cataract surgeon, and I would like him to take him through his journey on corneal perforations in these COVID-19 testing times.
Thank you for the kind introduction. Am I audible?
Yes, Dr. Nikunj, you are very much audible. Before Dr. Nikunj starts, this is the last speaker we have, last presentation. After this, we'll be having a question answer round. So if you have any questions and you are not able to start your mic or your camera, you can add it in the chat box or Q&A box. You can add it there as well. We'll definitely take care of it. Thank you so much. Over to you, Dr. Nikunj.
Thank you so much. I would like to thank AIOS and Dr. Somshila ma'am for giving me the opportunity to talk about management of corneal perforations in COVID times, our experience. I don't have any financial disclosures. So we all know that COVID has changed the world. It is, we recently saw another dark side of the COVID during second wave in the form of post-COVID mucormycosis. And along with COVID, there have been multiple phases of lockdown. And because of lockdown, so many other medical services have been affected, including corneal tissue availability and corneal transplantation. So there are multiple articles published during these times, which shows that the corneal transplantation has been vastly affected all over the world. There was also fear of having transmission of COVID by harvesting cornea from the donor who has acquired COVID. And so it is recommended in this to do RT-PCR test from the nasopharyngeal swab of the donors and also from the blood. Another data from the American Eye Bank Association from the March 2020 that the volume of tissue distribution has drastically come down to 7% at the domestic level in US and internationally to 6%, which even went further down to only 4% and 1%. And just within a matter of weeks, the ophthalmic care came down to halt in the United States and all over the world, including elective corneal transplantation. So corneal perforation is one of the true ophthalmic emergencies. It has a varied presentation, and most of the corneal perforations have etiology in the form of infective keratitis. And you can see that in certain larger perforations, you need actually urgent therapeutic penetrating keratoplasty to save those eyes. But during COVID times, it has become a huge challenge for every corneal surgeon to manage such eyes because of unavailability of the corneal tissues. So these are the protocol which we followed during COVID times in Sitapur. So for all the routine impending perforations or small perforations, tissue adhesives with cyanoacrylate glue and BCL was the procedure of choice for most of the cases. The dilemma was when the perforation was little larger, more than 2 millimeter, but less than 5 millimeter. So if we didn't have any option, we have went ahead with the tissue adhesives on such cases also, and we have got good results for that. Another technique which is unconventional, which we have applied, I have learned from my senior, is tissue adhesive followed by a layer of a plastic drape, which is very thin, followed by another layer of tissue adhesive, and over that BCL. I'll be showing a video of that. Tenon's patch graft, Dr. Purvasha has covered very nicely, so I'll not go into detail of that. And I will show a case of conjunctival pudding flap, which I have performed for a case where perforation was in the periphery. For larger perforations, it is important, if possible, to do a very gentle B-scan by an expert to rule out vitreous exudates. And if you see any evidence of endophthalmitis, in such cases, it will be advisable to go for evisceration. But if the patient has a perception of light and there is no evidence of any vitreous exudates in the posterior segment, we have saved few eyes by doing Gunderson flap, which is an old surgery, but still in such desperate times, it has been a huge help. So recently there is an article in Indian Journal of Ophthalmology about the use of glycerin preserved corneal tissue in emergency corneal transplantation. So if you have any corneal tissue available, use them judiciously. Try to preserve the corneal scleral rim, so which can be used for a patch graft in an emergency situation where there is another perforation in certain scenarios, and you can preserve the corneal scleral rim in the glycerin. So I'll be showing this one of the case where there is a corneal ulcer with central microperforation, but the anterior chamber is flat. So after anesthetic, application of anesthetic and trying the surface, I'm applying the cyanoacrylate glue using 30 gauge needle, covering the perforation in the surrounding tissue slowly, letting it to dry and crystallize. After crystallization, another 30 gauge needle is inserted tangentially carefully to enter in the NC as anterior chamber is completely flat and the air bubble is inserted. You can see the air bubble reached the opposite end of the limbus, which means the anterior chamber is completely formed and the BCL was applied. So in such cases where the perforation is little large and there is a uveal tissue prolapse, the different approach we applied. So after applying the anesthetic, the surface is dried. The first layer of cyanoacrylate glue, making a hanging drop preparation, is applied. After letting it dry a little bit, and another layer of a plastic drape cut in the fashion to cover the defect is applied over it, and it is also allowed to dry. Following which, the anterior chamber formation is attempted using a 30 gauge needle and air bubble is inserted, but you can see the air bubble is not reaching to the opposite end of the limbus because of the uveal tissue incarcerated into the corneal perforation. So after making the side port and inserting a little bit of OVD, the uveal tissue is reposited back into the anterior chamber, and you can see after reposition of the uveal tissue, still the area of perforation is not leaking, and it is withholding the perforation. The drape is still there. Following which, the air bubble is complete, and there is another layer of cyanoacrylate glue is applied, and over it the BCL is inserted. So this technique is unconventional. It was a desperate measure in desperate time, but it has worked for us and it has shown a good results in certain cases. But definitely these patients will need a definitive treatment of corneal transplantation at a later date. This particular case I managed with a similar technique where the perforation was approximately 2.5 millimeter in size with the flat anterior chamber. So multi-layer glue over drape over glue is applied, and following is the anterior chamber is formed with the air bubble and BCL was applied, and patient's eye was salvaged. This is the case where there was a peripheral limbal tear with the tissue loss and uveal tissue was prolapsed. So the scleral patch graft was fashioned from the previously preserved corneal scleral rim from a previously done corneal transplantation. You can see the patch graft is well sutured to the cornea and sclera on both the sides, and then conjunctiva is closed over it, and the anterior chamber is very well formed without any leak. This is another case of the corneal perforation with the uveal tissue prolapse having on the peripheral perforation on the nasal side. So after reposition of the uveal tissue back into the anterior chamber, I fashioned the conjunctival Tenon flap and pulled it over the area of perforation, then sutured it to the cornea using a pulse string kind of a suture, and then patient's perforation was healed and patient did well following the procedure. In such cases where there is a large perforation with the total corneal melt, where in an ideal scenario you would want a corneal tissue available to do a therapeutic corneal transplantation, but during COVID times we didn't have tissue, so I went with the Gunderson flap And after end of 1 month, the last picture is of at the end of 1 month, the graft is retracted from above and below because of the elasticity of the tissue and contraction of the conjunctiva, but still it is covering the defect and the eye was salvaged. So it is always better than at least evisceration. And this patient was also managed with a definitive corneal transplantation later date. So this is the case I want to share, which I've been managing since last year's COVID lockdown period and post-lockdown period where tissues were not available. So patient presented to us in June 2020 with the central corneal perforation with surrounding corneal abscess. In an ideal scenario, I would have gone with the therapeutic penetrating keratoplastics right away. But as tissues were not available at that time, I went ahead with the cyanoacrylated glue and BCL application in June. After which, after a long follow-up and close follow-up and meticulous medical management, the cornea completely healed with the total corneal scar and vascularization. With the vascularization managed with final diathermy before preparing the cornea for the transplantation. Patient underwent corneal transplantation in October 2020, but this was not the end. Patient again presented with loose sutures and reinfection and along with hypopyon. So after resuturing and change of medications, patient's graft survived, and this is the photograph of December. And recently, I've seen the patient in May 2021, and patient's graft is still surviving. So with these multiple options available and with the meticulous management, we have been able to salvage many eyes. Important thing is you have to be very patient. I would like to thank Dr. Karan. He has been a great mentor to me. He is my brother and my best friend. He has also helped a lot with this presentation. And thank you so much for kind listening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nikunj. Big congratulations and thank you to all the moderators, chairpersons, and speakers for keeping the conference in time. All right, so I would request Dr. Vinit, Dr. Purvasha, all the chairperson and moderators to please conclude the session. And also, if anyone is having any questions, please go ahead.
Yeah, so thank you, everyone. Thank you to all the speakers. We'll now be taking up a few questions. Dr. Mukesh, if you're around.
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah, so could you please provide certain views on the keratoconus addition procedures? What is your take on them?
So the talk by Bhupesh was very interesting. Personally, I have not much idea about it in the sense I've not done the procedure, but I've been following up the literature a bit on this. And what Bhupesh mentioned was he was basically doing it because it was a thin tissue and to do collagen cross-linking. As far as the thickness is concerned, 350 to 400 can be easily managed with the HPMC, and there are many techniques to manage that. I would be more interested in doing this procedure if it can increase the vision or make the cornea more stable, which we have not seen with much of the publications which have been there. That is not very easy to do. Basically, because what you would need is, you would need a lenticule from an eye which has undergone a hyperopic smile. I mean, smile for a hyperopic eye. What Shri Ganesh from Bangalore, they have published a series where they have taken about 7-8 eyes for which hyperopic smile was done. And they had punched the central tissue to make it a donut kind of a thing. What you want is the central cornea should become flat, okay? Because it's a myopic eye. It's not easy to achieve that. And second is it's an irregular cornea and the cone is not right there in the center. To achieve a post-procedure flattening of the K will not be easy because you're not very sure where it will go high, where it will get flattened. So as far as achieving a post-operative flattening of the cornea is concerned, it will be very difficult to predict. It will be a very unpredictable procedure. That's the reason we have not been doing it much or at LVPI, and even otherwise I have not done it. Because even in intact, predictability is an issue. And in this, the predictability will be even more difficult to predict what is the visual outcome is concerned. As far as collagen cross-linking is concerned, it is one of the ways to manage a thin cornea. That is what I would say. If Bhupesh is around, I would like to know what was his result as far as the vision is concerned. Did the patient felt better visually speaking, or there was no much of a difference in that?
Dr. Bhupesh?
Bhupesh, you are muted.
Okay. So as all these patients are advanced keratoconus patients, so most of these have cylinder of around 8 diopters, of myopia of 6 diopter to 9 diopter, 10 diopter, something like that. So in all these patients, the average flattening was around 2.5 to 3 diopters. Okay. And the best part was that contact lens fitting was easier in post-operative period in all these patients, because the cornea was slightly flatter, like someone is having 58 or 60 diopters, they are now 56, 57. So best rated visual acuity was slightly better, although patient don't feel any magical response. So my first aim for performing this procedure was to perform collagen cross-linking safely, because with hypoosmotic agents and all those things, or epi-on cross-linking, those are not as effective as epi-off cross-linking. So first aim was to perform epi-off cross-linking, which was successfully done in all the cases. Second, to give them good best rated visual acuity, which I was able to achieve in these patients. Because if I don't do cross-linking this patient, ultimately they're going to land up in hydrops and then keratoplasty. So till now, all these patients are saved from keratoplasty. So these are the 3 goals from this technique.
So I would say that it's an interesting procedure, but I guess we need to evolve nomograms.
Definitely.
And what probably would be the best possible tissue to go into this particular eye. So it needs a little bit more studies, more research. But yes, for a beginning, yes, it makes a lot of sense to add tissue to a cornea which is already thinned out. But nomograms need to be evolved is what I feel.
Definitely.
Mukesh, in fact, we have recently published a series in JCRS on this same. So there, what we did was, like Bhupesh took this inlay from a patient who has undergone refractive surgery. So what we did was we used a donor cornea. So this way we could take a Bowman layer as well. As you know, that Bowman layer per se is fragmented in keratoconus patients. And what we found over a period of 3 years, there was stabilization. We could even do it in 270 odd microns, 300 microns. And the graft size or the inlay size that we took was, 180, 160 to 200. And it was, as Bhupesh mentioned, it is very easy to do. The surgery is very easy and you don't see any interface related issues. You are very right that it is very difficult to predict whether it will flatten, whether it will get steeper. So, but with these experience, what we found was if the thickness is quite high, the overall volume increases and patient becomes more myopic. But recently we did a few in which we had done in the center, we did a PTK. So you thinned out in the center and those patients, they did well for flattening also. But majority, the basic aim is to stabilize the keratoconus, and then later on you can always do a TGPRK. One of our patients who had undergone this BS inlay procedure 3 years back, we recently did a TGPRK. So, and we didn't do any cross-linking in primary because we thought that if you are implanting a Bowman layer, then you don't need a cross-linking. But you are right that, we need to evolve a few more nomograms, and maybe it can be a, additive tool, and maybe it may be even an alternative to cross-linking also. You never know. Bhupesh, I want to ask one thing. Why did you remove that 8 to 10 microns from the patient's eye?
So till now, around 10 patients I performed on the Zimmer machine, Zimmer Z8. They have the lenticular option. So in that machine, we don't need to remove the lenticle. They can customize the procedure. You just cut the interface and put the lenticle. But with the Smile machine, the engineer told me that without removing, you cannot insert. The software will have to be working toto. So you have to remove something.
You can even use your routine LASIK software. That's what we did. The area from where the air gets out, you just increase the size. We had increased it to 3 mm, and you can use that to implant your. And we had used even IOL injector to do the same. But I think I would like to congratulate Dr. Somashila for putting up such fantastic session. And everyone had done a really great justice. It was a very exciting session. Lot of, almost all the procedures were covered. Great. Congratulations to everyone. Vineet, do you have any other questions?
Yes, just in context to what Dr. Mukesh and you just mentioned, since we had a talk from Dr. Astha Singh, do you think that, as you mentioned, the need of standardization and nomograms, do you think an application of hydrogels and biosynthetic corneas shaped to this particular requirement can have a future in keratoconus? I mean, this question is open to both our chairperson.
I think Mukesh would answer that better. But what I feel is this will be good for, there where there is a melt, there is a thinning. Those, I think, Astha, you have used it more in those cases, right? Not to increase the thickness of the cornea, right?
Yes, sir. So we have mostly our indications would be like neurotrophic ulcers and post scars. However, we have that option and those indications also in mind, like cases such as keratoconus. So probably that would be a step 2 in this direction.
That will be really great. Mukesh, what do you feel about it?
What Vikas said, that tissue adhesion will increase the thickness, and then probably you're better placed to modulate the shape of the cornea and by the refractive means, by either by ablation or otherwise. So that might be the future. I mean, you might possibly do the tissue adhesion, and then you have much more tissue to play around with the refractive means. That might be the future to increase the vision in keratoconus.
In fact, Mukesh, in one of our patients, this was a 16-year-old boy. In one eye, we did this inlay, the addition procedure, and other eye, we did a cross-linking. And after, 3 years, both are stable, both eyes are stable. Rather, the one which we had used an inlay, that got flattened a bit. So that's the exciting things coming up.
Just turning the attention towards the initial part of our talks, which was related to endothelial keratoplasty. So we have Dr. Vikas Mittal over here, who has been very innovative in this field in the training aspect and the wet lab procedures. Could you add some points to it, Dr. Vikas, like for the learners who are transitioning right now from DSEC to DMEC?
I think Nidhi had covered that so well, and that this EKLG platform is an amazing place. I think the ones who are who want to learn DMEC, I think the first thing they should do is go to Facebook and see all these things. And we have, wet lab models already in place. You have how to, peel off the DM, how do you use that DM into the anterior chamber, and you can make an artificial anterior chamber with latex, the glove material. And also, I think you need to have a lot of wet lab, and the reflexes used in DMEC is altogether different. These are not related to your DSEC reflexes. And another thing I would like to highlight is person should know DSEC well. So once you know your DSEC well, then only you go for DMEC, because if you have a failed DMEC, your confidence level goes down. But if you somehow do DSEC and ensure that the patient gets good vision, you'll be able to take up your next case early. So know your DSEC very well and spend a lot of time in wet lab watching videos before you take up DMEC. But I'm sure that it's not a really if you can learn DSEC, if you can learn phacoemulsification, you can learn DMEC as well.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Vikas, for that insight. Since we have last 2 minutes and we did cover some areas of ocular surface, and if Dr. Swapna is around, I just wanted to ask, where do you think is the future related to the SLET and MMG procedures?
Hi, thanks. Thanks, Vineet. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so related to SLET, we actually need to innovate more in the acute phase of chemical burns. So we are also holding, we'll be holding clinical trials in LVP for certain substances which might help us in the acute phase of chemical burns, and also more stem cell therapies, so that we do not, we see a lot of really severe chemical burns which are not salvageable even after, within the first few weeks if they're not properly treated. With SJS and MMG, it seems like whatever we have right now is working well. We have, before SJS would only be treated with lubricants and nobody could really identify what was to be done. But now we have so much better understanding of SJS with the lid margin keratinization. So We have scleral lenses, we have MMGs, we have MSGTs. So we have a lot more allogenic slit and a lot more things that are working very well now. But yeah, we need more innovation, and also we need to work on the fact that acute SJS needs to be treated very well so that we do not land up with all these complications. So I hope that's where we are headed.
Thank you so much, Swapna. And with this, I think we come to the end of this session. Thank you, our chairpersons, Dr. Vikas and Dr. Mukesh, for being with us till the very end. Thank you to all the speakers for giving us all your inputs and beautiful sessions organized by AIOC. I think this is the first ever subspecialty day by AIOC for cornea and other specialties. So congrats to all for being part of this. Thank you, Dr. Somashila.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
So much. Thank you so much, Purvasha and Vineet. You have worked very hard, did a lot of background work to ensure that these sessions go well in time. And that's why it was so smooth. And Prasad is not, saying anything. He knows that, we are going to finish in time. Thanks so much, Dr. Somashila. Wonderful session.
Thank you very much, everyone. This is historic. First time we had the subspecialty. So I really am envious that I couldn't be part of it together, but everyone did such a fabulous job. And want to thank the backend team, Prasad, and everybody else who made us stick to time. I think it's credit to them also. So it's very successful. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye. Have a nice evening.
All right. Thank you.